And guys in the back row, if you would let me know if you can't see the screen, that would be helpful. I know you have another one there, but as I change to code views and stuff like that, making sure that people can read things, and that goes for anybody in the room, but especially guys in the back row. All right. My name is Mark Stafford. I have the privilege of being a PM on the Microsoft Graph team. Microsoft Graph is an API, as we'll discover, that kind of absorbs a bunch of other APIs at Microsoft. So whether you're trying to get access to stuff that's in Azure Active Directory or Outlook or SharePoint or any one of a number of other places, Microsoft Graph is the place to do that. So my day job is actually really fun. I get to review all the new APIs that are onboarding to Microsoft Graph, so I get to know the roadmap way far out and see all the different APIs that are onboarding to Microsoft Graph. We talk a lot about the opportunity, and you've probably seen this slide already. If not, then you will see the slide coming up. But the Office opportunity in general is tremendous, right? We talk about how 90% of the Fortune 500 has data inside of Azure Active Directory and Microsoft Graph. There's 100 million monthly active users of Office 365. And because all these things are in Microsoft Graph, those things are directly available to you as you consume Graph itself. One thing that's new and unique about this slide, though, is this year at Build 2017, there were 69 mentions of Microsoft Graph in the keynotes. Every single one of the keynotes at Build mentioned Microsoft Graph, and they just talked about it over and over and over. It was the common thread woven throughout the keynotes. So it is a really important integration point with Microsoft technologies, and if you have data stored inside of Microsoft or your customers do, then Microsoft Graph is a great way to access it. That said, people get really confused about what Microsoft Graph actually is. I spent a bunch of time at the Build 2017 booth, and people would come up and they would just ask us, what is Microsoft Graph? I heard about this in the keynote. Can you please tell me what it is? And a lot of people tend to think that it has to do with charting technologies. It really doesn't. I want to spend just a bit of time to unpack this particular slide. So, and I'm going to read it verbatim first, and then we'll unpack it line by line. So Microsoft Graph provides a unified API and comprehensive developer experience for integrating the data and intelligence exposed by Microsoft services. In this particular case, there is only one API. Right? Whether you are authenticating with your consumer account, your Microsoft account, and that could be Outlook.com, Hotmail.com. I think we even support Gmail or Google users at this point in time. Whether you are authenticating with your corporate account, doesn't matter what tenant it is, all these things can walk up to Microsoft Graph and use it today. And again, whether you're accessing data from AAD or SharePoint or Planner or any one of the other APIs that's in Microsoft Graph, it's still just one API endpoint. And so rather than going to look up the documentation for each of those specific APIs, you have one place to go and onboard and start using these APIs. We provide a really comprehensive developer experience. We have SDKs in a variety of languages. We've got fantastic documentation. We've got a Explorer that you can use online that will help you to kind of browse through the API. You can use Postman. You name it. If you use it for REST APIs, you can do it today. And then the data and intelligence exposed by Microsoft services. The data part is obvious, right? People store files, they have emails, they have calendar invites, they have contacts. The intelligence part is not quite as obvious, but it's clearly a big theme at Microsoft going forward. And so, given all this data, we can start to infer relationships that might not otherwise exist. We can look at your calendar and understand who have you worked with a bunch over the past week, or who have you sent a bunch of emails to. And through this, we can actually suggest connections for you through various APIs. So there's actually AI working behind Microsoft Graph as well. So some of the types of data that are in Microsoft Graph today, there's lots and lots of people data since it works on top of Microsoft Azure Active Directory. So we've got things like, who do you report to? Who reports to you? Who else do you work with? What groups are you a member of? What content have you stored in the Microsoft Cloud, whether that's in OneDrive or whether that's in Outlook or SharePoint? What tasks have you created in Planner? What conversations are you having, whether that's in Skype or some other place? What devices are registered to you? And then finally, what are the new types of things that we can start to get over the graph itself? The recent activity that you've had, files that you've opened recently, or email messages that have action items in them. So more and more stuff is coming to Microsoft Graph all the time. There are two big chunks of Microsoft Graph. One is the data that we just kind of looked at and we'll actually dig into a little bit more deeply. But then there's also a set of capabilities that Microsoft Graph provides. And as we look at capabilities, we'll understand that these are things like, how do I batch multiple requests together? How do I get proactive notifications of changes to data that's stored in Microsoft Graph? But first, let's go ahead and dig into the data a little bit more deeply, and we'll actually explore a lot of this in the Microsoft Graph Explorer, so I don't want to spend too much time here. But Azure Active Directory, the main two things in Azure Active Directory are users and groups. Users obviously have a bunch of data. They've got a first name, a last name, who's their manager, who are their direct reports. Groups, we know the name, we know what type of group they are. If it's a Teams group, we know that and what the channels are. We know who's a member of that group, what the description of the group is. As we start to look at OneDrive, we bring in files and folders. And again, files and folders have a bunch of rich metadata about them. But the really great part about Graph is that these two things used to be separate, right? You would go to the OneDrive API to access OneDrive stuff, and you would go to Azure Active Directory to access users and groups. With the Graph, you can actually link between them really, really easily. So a file, for instance, has an authored by field that you can use to traverse directly into Azure Active Directory and get the user that created that file. Same thing with Outlook, right? So we've got mail and messages and calendar and all the obvious things. But the same relationship exists. So as I look at who authored a mail, I can traverse into Azure Active Directory, or I can traverse from an Azure Active Directory user into their messages or their calendar. Sorry, my mic is scraping. Let me see if I can. On my shirt. Better? Hopefully. Sorry about that. I just noticed. You guys can holler at me. It's a small room. And then there's a myriad of other APIs, like I mentioned. So SharePoint, Excel, OneNote, Planner. This is not an exhaustive list. We'll jump out in just a few minutes and take a look at some of the Microsoft Graph docs. And as we do that, you'll get a better feel for some of the things that exist out there. But even when we talk about Azure Active Directory, right, there's things inside of Active Directory that you might not know about. So there's something called Invitation Manager API, where you can actually invite an external user to come access resources in OneDrive or something along those lines. And behind the scenes, a guest account is created for them in Azure Active Directory, but there's APIs to do that sort of stuff inside of Microsoft Graph. So again, Microsoft Graph is kind of the one place where we're centralizing many of our API efforts and really focusing on providing you guys a great conduit for accessing the data in the Microsoft Cloud. Most of the APIs are in V1 today. However, there's a second version of Microsoft Graph that's exposed in beta. Beta has everything that V1 does, plus a bunch of stuff. So many of the announcements that we made at Build 2017 are currently in the beta endpoint. Things like Teams, which is frankly a very small API right now, but is going to be a big deal over time. Project Rome was talked about just a ridiculous amount at the Build keynotes. This has things like, if I'm doing a particular activity on my mobile device and I want to pick it up later on my desktop device, how do I do that sort of thing? Also, these APIs are inside of Microsoft Graph. Intune, so all your device management and security alerts and things like that. reports for Office 365 Health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The point is there's lots of data inside of Microsoft Graph, and it's only going to continue to grow. So the docs are the best place to see this sort of stuff. The slides can only ever be so up to date, but the docs tend to be the source of truth for the API. Okay, thank you.
Better?
Hopefully this one will be more stable. All right, so figure out where I was. I'm gonna shrink this down just a little bit. Okay, so if you go to graph.microsoft.com, this is the main landing page for Microsoft Graph. And from here, we have a number of different top links that we're going to actually work through as part of these demos. But really where I want to point you right now is the documentation. And this is the authoritative list of what is exposed inside of Microsoft Graph today. So part of our onboarding process, if a new API walks up to me and wants to onboard, is we say, okay, great, we do the API review, we do a series of other checks, and as part of those checks, we verify documentation. So there shouldn't be anything inside of Microsoft Graph that is not documented here. And so as you browse this tree, there's a bunch of overview content up on the top, including changelog, which are what are the changes that we're making to the API. And then right below the changelog is a big list of different resources that you can access. So if you want to know about groups, then you can go into the groups node. Each one of these nodes has at the top level an overview article of what it is that you're trying to access. So for instance, if I click on Azure Active Directory, it'll give me a bunch of conceptual content about what can I do with Azure Active Directory. So I can see, many of the APIs that I've mentioned, both users and groups are in Azure Active Directory. Excel is out there, OneDrive, OneNote, these are things that I've mentioned. We'll talk about extensions when we get to the capabilities, Planner, et cetera, et cetera. Way down at the bottom, there is also a beta reference. And the beta reference may list additional things. So we talked about Intune being in beta. So as I look at the beta reference, then I see a lot of the things that I saw above, but I also see Intune. And I'll see devices and things like that in other places. So the documentation is a really, really good place to go reference as you are looking for things. So how do you actually use the API is presumably the next question. Let me see if I can find my clicker. All right, so it's just a REST API, right? So if you're familiar with using REST APIs, then you will be rapidly familiar with Microsoft Graph. So there's a bunch of different HTTP verbs that you can use. You can use get, post, patch, put, delete. Patch and put tend to be updates. Post is typically a create. Delete is fairly obvious. Get is typically read. We don't use put as much anymore, so most things that you'll see to update the resources will use patch. And then you have to build a URL. The very first thing that you need on your URL is what version of Microsoft Graph are you trying to access? Right now there's only two versions. There's V1 and there's beta. Presumably in the future there will be a V2 as well, something that we're talking about. Once you have the version on there, then you can start to append the paths to individual resources. So that might be users or groups or sites, right, as you can see here. Typically, underneath paths, you can start to append further navigation. So for instance, I can add a particular ID to get an individual user. And we'll see this when we do the Graph Explorer demo in a minute. From there, I can actually start to navigate across APIs or within an API in order to find other things. So I can go from user/Mark to the department that Mark works for. And I can traverse to entirely unrelated APIs, such as events. Those are the things on my calendar. I can also use query string parameters to filter down the set of results that I'm getting. So the main three things that you need to worry about are, how do I format the results? I can use select and order by in order to constrain those sorts of things. Select allows me to just choose the set of properties that I get back. Order by is fairly self-evident. Filtering is also self-evident, but it's a very complex, very rich query language that you can supply there. It is reasonably well documented on the documentation site for Microsoft Graph. Expand allows me to bring in related resources. So if I want to bring in a user and their email messages or a user and their calendar items, I can choose to do that with expand. And then pagination is also very important. So you can control pagination using top and skip token. The server will also use a form of pagination called server-side pagination. And again, the documentation touches on this. So some of the common queries, and we're not going to go through this entire list, but I want to highlight just a few of them, are being able to access things like the currently authenticated user, right? So just /me will give you the currently authenticated user. And then there's all sorts of other things that you can do. You can choose to get your photo or your high importance email and other things. But to see this in action, let's just go look at the Graph Explorer. So if I go back to graph.microsoft.com again, and I click on Graph Explorer this time, then I get to the Graph Explorer. The Graph Explorer can be used as an initial testing tool to understand what sorts of queries can I run against Graph. And there's a few ways that you can use it. You're logged in by default as part of a demo tenant. So if I choose to run this particular query, I can see that I get a valid response back even though I haven't signed in. Now, behind the scenes, there is actually sign-in happening. We're just making it easier for you so you don't have to have a specific account in order to try the demo tenant. So there is still an OAuth 2 flow happening behind the scenes here. There's still an authentication token flowing to Microsoft Graph, but the Graph Explorer is obfuscating a lot of that for you and handling it. You can also choose to log in. So I can choose to log in either with my personal account. So I'm going to log in as Mark D. Stafford at Outlook.com. Now you guys can all spam me there. Oh. I think I confused it. Sorry. I was pressing enter and I think it canceled the redirect there. Let me try that one more time. So again, Microsoft Graph will work for you whether or not you are authenticated as just your personal account or whether you're using your corporate account. So I can see here in this particular case that I've got Mark Stafford showing up. We'll make that a little bit bigger. And obviously, no business phones or anything like that because I didn't set that on my personal account. Now, if I choose to sign out as my personal account and sign in instead as an actual AAD account, so we'll log in as Megan Bowen this time, my alter ego. We get a bit more information back because she has put some information into Azure Active Directory. So we can still see that she's Megan Bowen. The Graph Explorer has just an incredibly rich set of functionality. So it makes it very, very easy to run queries because you can just click on things over here in the left pane and get various different queries constructed for you. So Get My Profile is the one that we're looking at right now. So if I click on this, it doesn't really look like the screen changes because it just rendered the same query. However, if I click on Get My Photo, then I can see how the query would change and the result of that particular query. I can choose to look at the request headers if they exist. I can choose to look at the response headers. If I click on Get My Mail, then we'll continue to work our way down this list. In addition to the Getting Started queries, there's a button that says Show More Samples, or a link, I guess, that says Show More Samples. If you click on this link, it will open a pane that allows you to see all sorts of different queries. So Graph is large enough now that showing that full list of queries makes for a pretty crummy user experience. And so we allow you to toggle queries on and off that you actually care about. So if your application really only cares about Azure Active Directory, then you can turn on the user queries and turn off everything else. In this particular case, I'll just pick one more to show you the functionality. So we'll add Outlook Mail. And at that point in time, we'll get a new section here that talks about Outlook Mail. And as per usual, I can click on those queries. Now, to be able to send emails and things like that, you have to be logged in. So anything that is not a GET operation, you have to be logged into the Graph Explorer. But you can still do pretty much whatever you want inside of Graph Explorer because it is just a basic query composition tool, right? So I can change this to whatever verb I want. I can change the version, I can change the URL, and then I can set both a request headers and a request body. In this particular case, being able to send an email is telling me, hey, look, you should probably update the request body because that is where the meaningful content for the email goes. And so as I look at the request body, I see the message, the subject, what the body of the email currently is, and who this email is supposed to go to. So as I click run, then hopefully we expect a successful response. And there's no response body because we were sending an email in this particular case. Does that make sense? Any questions about the Graph Explorer before we move on? Okay. So Graph Explorer is a fantastic tool for prototyping and figuring things out. That said, not everybody likes to use Graph Explorer, and Postman is a really common tool for debugging REST APIs as well. So you can use Postman. The link here, and I believe we'll be sharing this deck, will help you to figure out how to configure Postman because it is a little bit challenging. So in Postman, let's see if we can make this larger. Maybe. There we go. Get rid of this list. So in Postman, the first thing that you're going to want to do is it'll default to no auth, right? So the first thing you want to do is change to OAuth 2. And then you can click on this Get New Access Token button. You have to fill in all the magic values, and that's where that link that I referenced in the slide deck comes in handy, especially with the auth URL and the access token URL. Those two ones are particularly important, and they are both in that link that I shared. You also need a client ID and a client secret. We'll see how to get these in just a minute because it's important for getting it for your Microsoft Graph application anyway. And then you have to specify scopes. So for right now, I'm going to trim this down to just user.read. We'll add mail.read in just a minute. And you can leave everything else as the default. I'll put the token name back to Postman, which is what I usually put. So now if I choose to request a token, I'm going to get an OAuth flow. I'll sign in as Megan again. And I'll choose to execute the get me query. Oh, okay, sorry. I'm using an old token. One other thing, you have to then select the token that you requested and choose to use it explicitly on your request. And you can choose to use it either in a header or URL, but use it in the header. So now let's try that request again. And so now we get that same valid response back where we can see Megan Bowen and all the information from AAD. So Postman will work just fine with Microsoft Graph. It's a little bit more convoluted to get started, but it's really useful for sharing queries, right? So you can build collections and you can share them with your coworkers and all sorts of interesting things. Now if I try to go access /me/messages, I'm going to get an error message, and I'll explain why in just a second. I should get an error message. Okay, well, let's do me/calendar. So I get an error message that says access is denied, and if I go look at the status code, then it's 403 forbidden. The token that you request has to have the right permission scopes on it, right? And so when we go back to the request itself, and we look at the Get New Access Token dialog, I should have gotten the error because I removed the mail.read permission from this. I'm not sure why it carried through. Well, here's one thing that we can do. Okay, so apparently, even though we removed that particular scope, Postman requested it for me anyway, and we can see in the token as I select it, this decodes the the access token, I can see that I still had the mail.read and user.read permissions. So if I choose to get a new access token and I choose to add to it calendar.read, oh, calendar.read is not a valid scope. I would have to go look up what that scope is. But as you add additional permissions here, so I'll add mail.read back in. Then you can request a new token with the appropriate permissions on it. And so it is important to understand which API calls require which permissions. Most of that is documented on Microsoft Graph, but if I'm being entirely honest, we have work to do there. And please be aware that we are very focused on this issue, and we want to do a better job of documenting permissions. All right. So we talked a bunch about data. Let's talk a little bit about the capabilities that Microsoft Graph exposes. There's authentication information that gets exposed as part of Microsoft Graph. Now, really behind the scenes, this is actually Azure Active Directory doing the authentication. So again, anything that you can authenticate with Azure Active Directory, you can use with Microsoft Graph. There's also a bunch of OAuth scopes that are available for various API calls. If we go look at the documentation, so I go back to graph.microsoft.com, and I look at the documentation. These are somewhat reasonably exposed. I believe it's under Use the API. It is not under Use the API. See if we can find permissions in here somewhere. All right, here we go. So this permissions reference lists all the different permissions that you have available. So that string that I used, I had put calendar.read. It should have been calendars.read. But this gives you the full list of different permissions that you can be asked for. So as you need access to new parts of the API, whether that's your calendar or whether that's looking for files or something along those lines, this permissions reference is a really, really good resource for you to go take a look at. In OData, we have capabilities like filtering and ordering and pagination. We talked about some of the query string parameters and what they do. We also have the same level of compliance that all the individual workloads have. Right? So we do enforce conditional access if you have configured that for Microsoft Exchange. And these are things like if you require a PIN to authenticate, then we will respect that. We are qualified in many national clouds, not all of them, but many national clouds. And we are working on ISO certification and things like that as well. Some specific query patterns that we've added to Microsoft Graph are webhooks and Delta. Both of these help you to understand when changes have been made. Right? So webhooks says, whenever a change is made, please come ping my application back. And Delta allows you to just request the changes since a particular point in time. So the two of those work in really great concert in order to be able to understand changes over time. Batching allows you to put multiple different requests together into the same payload, and we'll take a look at this in just a second. And then extensions allows you to actually add your own data to certain objects inside of Microsoft Graph. So I was talking to a customer a couple days ago now. They are based out of the UK. They do healthcare software there. And they were talking to me about how they have their own DocumentDB database that they're extending AAD users with. And so they're storing additional information that indicates where are they geographically, what applications do they use, what UI do they prefer, and things like this. So for simple scenarios like that, we really don't want you to have to go set up a DocumentDB database and a service over the top of that. We want you just to be able to simply extend Azure Active Directory and store that sort of information in there. So it's a perfect use case for where extensions would be helpful. In addition to that, we produce a whole bunch of SDKs and tools. You've seen some of them, and we'll walk through a few others. So if we were to reverse engineer a Microsoft Graph application, how would it look? Let's see if we have a laser here. Oh, wow, that laser is teeny tiny. Can people see that? No, okay, fine. I'll use my hand to point. So here's a simple application that we have. This is a demo application that we're producing. It's called the OOF Assistant, and actually we have much better screens for it now. It's a Xamarin application, but as we're building this, you need to understand which Microsoft Graph API calls need to be made. So the basic idea of the application is if you're going to be out of the office for a period of time because you're sick or you're on business or something along those lines, there's a bunch of things that need to happen, right? You need to go address the items on your calendar and either cancel them or postpone them or decline them. You need to deal with tasks, right? And you need to either, again, postpone them or cancel them or assign them to someone else. So as we start to look at how do we understand this thing, well, to be able to go look at that information, then the user's name, their email address, their photo, all of that stuff is under /me. Specifically, the photo is under /me/photo. I can store information like preferences, so that story that I just told about the customer in the UK. I can store information about preferences using me/extensions. I can go get their calendar by doing me/calendar/calendar view. I can also look at the raw events, but calendar view allows me to deal with things like I've got recurring meetings that are showing up in this time period. And if I need to choose to postpone a meeting, then I can use me/find meeting times in order to identify new meeting times that are showing up. To access tasks, I can go to me/planner/tasks. And then wherever I have a screen that's combining multiple different types of calls, like this first one or like this second screen, I can choose to use $batch in order to combine those multiple calls together into one call. So let's take a look at what batching actually looks like. It is fairly straightforward, but we'll just look at it in the Graph Explorer. So graph.microsoft.com, Graph Explorer. And so I have already turned on batching in the Show More Samples. There is in Show More Samples a batching beta, and I have turned it on here. So I see the sample batch requests. I have now clicked on one of them. So you can see batching just goes to a special endpoint. It goes to $batch. And the real trick here is we just kind of smashed everything together into the request body. So now we've got, as the actual request body, we've got a requests array, and I'll try to make that a little bit bigger yet, although my Chrome is really hurting. Each request has a URL and a method and an ID. In addition to those three things, they can have other things. They can have a headers and a body as well, although I think these three requests only have the URL, method, and the ID. Those three properties are required. And it's fairly straightforward, right? So I've got three requests here, one that's fetching me, one that's fetching my messages, and one that's fetching things on my calendar. You can get significantly more advanced with this. Obviously, if you're posting, then you're going to need headers and a body. You can even declare dependencies between the different requests to say that this request has to run first. And over the fullness of time, we will add additional capabilities beyond that. So to develop with Microsoft Graph, really the first thing you want to do is try the Graph Explorer. We've seen that a couple times today. It's very, very easy to use, even if you don't have an account set up yet. The next thing that you want to do is to try a quick start, and we'll do a demo next for what the quick starts look like. After that, you'll want to register an application. I've already done this with Postman. That's how I had the client ID and client secret. You will need to do this for your application that consumes Microsoft Graph, and we'll walk through that as well. Then you want to look for SDKs and samples. You'll see a lot of this as we do the quick start demo. read the docs, which we've looked at, and then finally build and distribute your application. So what do the quick starts look like? If you are developing a graph application for the first time, a really, really good resource is quick starts. So let me try to make this a reasonable size. So there's a quick start link here that I'm going to go ahead and click on. As you do the quick start, you can choose to the platform that you're going to be building on top of, right? And so in this case, I'll just go ahead and pick ASP.NET MVC. The next thing that's going to happen is it's going to tell you, hey, look, you need an app ID and secret, right? This is a bit of a shortcut for how to do this process. We'll look at the full process in just a second. So we'll say get an app ID and secret. I'm going to go ahead and copy my secret because this is the only time that I will see it. It's not just a alarming warning. We need that value. Sorry. Oh, for Pete's sake, thank you. Sorry. That happens every so often when I duplicate my screen, and that happens every so often. So thank you for letting me know. I'll restart the demo. Okay, let's restart that demo. Go graph.microsoft.com. Quick start. We'll pick ASP.NET MVC. We'll click Get an App ID and Secret. We'll copy that value now, and we'll click Got it. Take me back to the quick start. Now I've got my app ID and I've got my client secret on the clipboard. So now we can just choose to paste in the secret here and click download the SDK-based code sample, and everything should be working for us at this point in time. So now, if I should have done this differently, click on downloads, extract all. I'm just going to open up the solution. Security warnings. Okay, so as we look at this particular solution, make that larger and change my display color. Can you guys read that? Or is the dark theme too hard to read? Okay, so it already has my app ID and my app secret in here. These are the things that I pasted, and just to prove it, we'll go ahead and paste that secret there again. So it actually filled in all the secret information for me. And you can go ahead and build this and run it right away. And so we'll let that build and run. But there's a variety of quick starts. We'll come back to that in just a second here. So Android, Angular, iOS, right? There's a whole bunch of things that you can start from. So really, the very first time that you build a graph application, these are good ways to get started and just start goofing around before you actually build something seriously. Oh, good. IIS SSL certificate. Yes, I'd like to install that. And so the end result of it is going to be something along the lines of what we'll see here. There's a couple basic read calls to graph, and there's a basic write call to graph that is really not particularly interesting, but it is a foundation to build on top of. So at this point in time, I can click Get Email Address, and as per usual, it's going to ask me to authenticate, right? So I'll authenticate as Megan B. Asks for consent for this particular application. I click Accept. Now it's got my email address, and I can choose, I'll make that a little bit bigger as well. It's got my email address, and I can choose to send an email. I'll just send the stock text here, and then it should say success in just a second here. Success, your email was sent. So again, Not life-changing, but it is a really, really easy way to get started. So quick starts are a good thing. The library that those things are using is a library called MSOL, Microsoft Authentication Library, or Microsoft Account Library, rather. There are two versions of libraries that can work against AAD. There's a library called ADOL, which is the older one. It's Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, and the MSOL, which is the newer one. They are currently in production-ready preview. So we do recommend using MSOL whenever you can against Microsoft Graph. Now, the really big difference, I'm just going to fast forward through this slide because we're trying to catch up on time. The biggest difference between MSOL and ADOL is with ADOL, you kind of have to know up front what your consent requirements are. With MSOL, you can choose to add requirements along the way, right? So in Postman, for instance, we added a permission as it was necessary, right? And so there's this idea of incremental consent, only consent to the things that you actually need in your particular application. It's not possible with ADOL. It is possible with MSOL, so we would recommend, in general, using MSOL. You don't have to use an authentication library at all. Again, it's just basic OAuth 2 flows, so if you understand OAuth 2 and how to use it, then you can go ahead and do that directly. Postman is not using either ADOL or MSOL. It's just using basic OAuth 2 functionality. The libraries do, however, make it easier. And let me just fast forward to this slide as well. I'm gonna summarize quickly. So the idea here is there's two ways to get permissions. You can either get permissions for what conceptually runs as a service or a daemon somewhere. Behind the scenes, only an admin can consent to this particular type of thing, and whatever the application has permissions to, it has permissions to, regardless of user. When you're authenticating as part of a user, well, then the users can consent for their particular data. Admins still have to consent for certain types of data. Let me give you one example. If you want to look at group membership, it is possible that you could get some sort of security information from those group memberships. So pretend that you have a group called SQL Server Admins. We don't want to leak the members of that particular group because now it gives you people to go attack. And so something like who are members of this particular group is an admin consent permission. But at the end of the day, whatever permissions the application requests, the user also has to consent to in order to get those permissions. And of course, a user is only going to have permissions to what they have permissions to. So even if I've told a particular application access my files, if I'm trying to access a file that belongs to my manager and she has not granted me permissions to that, then I can't access it in the application. App registration demo is going to have to be canceled, but there is good documentation about how to register an application. This particular link will take you to the place that you need to go to register an application. Fairly straightforward for the most part, and there is reasonably good documentation on it. SDKs, samples, and tooling. We covered these in the quick starts, but these are the major platforms that we cover today. And we're always looking to add platforms to this. So we'll probably add Java in the near future. Many of these have been updated or refreshed at build timeframe. And we've updated our VS integration tooling as well. So the C# SDK was used in that application that we just looked at. So let's jump over to Visual Studio. Maybe let me try killing my PowerPoint presentation this time. So here in Visual Studio, as we start to look at different helpers and things like that, actually, let's look at I think it's the home controller that we want to look at. So I've got this graph service thing here, and I can start to do various different requests. So I can say, let's just go to the definition of this method here. So I'll get typical IntelliSense. Oh no. keyboard shortcuts are almost dead. Okay, so we'll just do me dot, oh, and you really can't see that. So it's showing about me, account enabled, additional data, assigned licenses, assigned plans. So the SDKs have good IntelliSense for what are the other parts of the API that you can go access. So of course, being able to access the calendar, right? And as I dot into the calendar, I can choose to do calendar view. So that one screen that we looked at where I was doing me/calendar/calendar view, the SDKs will help you to discover that sort of thing. But it's not just .NET that we do that sort of thing in. So if I open up Visual Studio Code, so this is an application that is using TypeScript and the JavaScript SDK underneath the surface. However, if I go look at the NPM configuration for this guy, it talks about a typing library that helps me, even in JavaScript, to build a nice experience. So if I go over here to index and look at users, I'm going to get a similar IntelliSense. Right? So if I do users, I've got about me, account enabled, assigned licenses. I can go into calendar again and get calendar view, etc. So the SDK should work reasonably well across the board and provide a really, really good starting point for you to work. Let me fast forward to where we were. So just to kind of recap and bring things back around, we made a bunch of announcements at Build 2017. These are some of the things that we added. The emboldened items were either added to generally available or preview, depending on their column. A couple that bear special mention. The Project Rome stuff at the bottom was one of the most popular topics at Build 2017. It is still a work in progress, as is Teams, but both APIs are there today and available for you to use. And we also added a bunch of capabilities at Build 2017, adding Delta Query for AAD and Outlook, batching, etc. Again, these slides will be available for your perusal afterwards. The Graph Explorer was dramatically updated. If you want to engage with us, there are three main places that we engage: on Twitter at #MicrosoftGraph, on GitHub at github.com/MicrosoftGraph is the organization. And then on Stack Overflow, you can tag your questions as Microsoft Graph as well. But that said, I've tried to move as quickly as I can through this deck to leave some time for questions and still get you out on time. So we have 2 minutes, but we can go as long as we need to with questions. Okay, well, I am around if you need me.